We're back covering this 4th season, kicking things off with part 2, episode 6, titled Best of Friends. A very interesting episode to kick off this 2nd half, and I'm so excited to be back with you all. But that being said, let's break down this 6th episode. Full spoilers ahead. As we see, Jonathan looks in on Reese giving a speech as he continues his campaign as mayor. As we see, Jonathan is determined at taking him down and he wants to get him alone. Meanwhile, the mysterious woman from part 1, seen taking photographs of Jonathan, makes her return. But the question early on for me was, who is this lady? Is she hired by the Quinn family? Is she maybe a journalist who realized since Jonathan joined this group of people and all of a sudden they're dead and she's trying to figure it all out? Well, speaking of figuring it all out, we're going to be talking about this character a little bit later, but back to some type of normalcy. We see that Roll tells Kate that he's going to be taking a family trip for a few months, and he invites her, but she declines because she's going to be hosting this event. So to me, Roll being off the table means that the show is trying to probably give Reese more screen time, or let's continue to think about Roll and what he can be doing. Do you all think he's going to be gone for the entirety of this season, or is there something else going on? Let's talk about that in the comment section. Let's talk about some characters that we're introduced to, and that is a new character by the name of Steve. Now, Steve appears to be some type of diamond seller, and he's also a car collector, as he wants to make a bet with Adam on his engagement with Phoebe. Which, speaking of Phoebe, she feels like she's being followed, and she's afraid that it's the Eat the Rich killer, as she has a brief mention of Vic's absence. Now, I'm going to be honest with you all. I have to admit, the lack of empathy of him missing just seems so odd to me, that she wouldn't be interested in knowing what happened to him. Maybe his family would want to know what happens to him. I'm very curious if they're going to address the absence of Vic, especially after Phoebe gets kidnapped. So let me know if you all think Vic's storyline is just completely dead, or is there still some meat on that bone? Let's talk about that in the comment section. As now the whole Nadia suspicions continues for me, as she's talking to Jonathan about researching Reese, and she just conveniently gives him a tip on where Reese likes to jog in the morning. And just like she conveniently gave Jonathan Reese's book back in episode 1, I'm telling y'all, I don't think it's a coincidence that she's always having some type of connections with Reese, and we'll talk about Nadia a little bit later. But Jonathan gets his wish as Reese pays him a visit, and he's looking for a friend, and that's Jonathan. Now, Reese goes over his whys for killing, as he talks about Malcolm was going to blackmail him for gambling, as we know from the last part. Simon was exploiting women, who would have been a bad look for him. And Gemma, she probably just simply would have ruined his image. But Reese lets it slip out. I don't know if you all caught this. He said that he was once married in the past. So my question for you all, who's his ex-wife? And I wonder if Joe's going to look into this and maybe expose him for his past. So that's something we're going to keep an eye out for. And remember, in the future episodes, will we find out who Reese used to be married to? Now, we see Reese claims to care for Joe because they have a lot in common, as he gives him a chance to make up for not framing Roll in the finale of part 1. Joe must find someone to place the blame on, and he has to do it, and if he doesn't, he's going to end up being the fall guy. Now, I got a tip for Joe. I think it'll be smart for him to start carrying a voice recorder or a tape recorder next time he's going to meet with Reese to have some leverage. I think that would be a good idea, right? But our mysterious photographer, we see that she manages to get hired on Kate's staff for this event, as Phoebe spills the beans on her friends, as Joe searches for a way in to find someone to put the blame on, and the person gets brought up, and that is Connie, who appears to be his first option because Connie doesn't have an alibi. So that leads us into meeting another character here by the name of Nico, who is a single man who's immediately flirting with Kate, and he also has some daddy issues, as we see Joe watches this interaction. Going back to Joe, he sets his sight on Connie, and they have a meeting, and we see Connie tells him that the police are indeed investigating him, and Connie actually wants help from Joe, and we see Joe starting to kind of feed into his pity party just a little bit, and he's starting to feel a little bit guilty, and this is where he gets the message from Reese that he applies the pressure on Joe, and he tells him that he has 24 hours to get this done, and just to put a little bit more pep in his step, he puts Simon Ear in his own freezer. Man, I'm telling y'all, Reese is 10 steps ahead of Joe at this point. But we head to the event where we see Nadia and Edward are in attendance, and they're all of a sudden dating. Yet again, conveniently, we see Nadia at this party for the rich, and we know Edward comes from money. I have a feeling that she is the second killer. My whole theory that she might be involved. I also think the reason she might be there is because she might be spying on Joe to see if he actually completes his assignment. We see Joe meditating with Connie, who's attending rehab soon. We see Joe tries to plant the ear in his pocket, but he kind of misses that window of opportunity. Meanwhile, our mysterious woman gathers Phoebe and takes her to a safe room by the orders of the police, as we see Nadia tries to take a selfie with Phoebe, but she notices something's off and she warns Joe. Now we finally get the name of the mysterious woman, and her name is Dawn, as she locks Phoebe in the room and reveals herself as a friend, and she wants to take care of her. And we can tell right off the bat that she's seemingly just a stalker that's obsessed, and she's a big fan of Phoebe. She's got a tattoo on her arm because she seems to think that she's her soul sister. She pulls out a knife, and we see that Phoebe is just straight up frightened, as Dawn knows everything about her. She even goes on to spill the beans about Adam's debt and him being unfaithful to Phoebe. Now, cutting back to Joe, we know that he's a stalker himself. He manages to find the room that she has Phoebe in, as we see Dawn inevitably lets him in, but then Dawn realizes that she knows who he is because she's been taking the photos of him, and she's convinced that he's a con man, as we have this very, very interesting moment with Joe, as Joe has to look in the mirror, and seamlessly he's talking to himself as he's talking to Dawn that she's created this imaginary relationship with Phoebe, and this is all been an illusion created in her head. Kind of tying to you guys' thoughts on Reese here, but as we know, Joe has done this since season 1 with Beck and others, so he's a pretty much an expert at kind of creating these different fantasy relationships. As eventually the police find them, we see that Joe actually managed to put Simon's ear in her bag, and seamlessly mission complete. But we see Nadia is watching all this take place. She seems to be concerned. We cut to the next day, and we see Dawn is now being officially coined as the actual killer, and we see this conversation taking place between Nadia as she tells Edward about her suspicions about Jonathan and his connections to always saving Phoebe. So maybe my theory might be off with Nadia, but we'll see where all this comes. But we wrap up this 6th episode with Adam proposing to Phoebe, but she refuses after Dawn gave her all the information about his debt. So she gives him an ultimatum: Adam, I'll come back with you as long as you take care of your finances alone. So we'll see what comes of that relationship this new part. As we cut over to Kate and Nico as they begin to hook up, and she notices that a message comes through on his phone from her own father, and she's easily able to put the pieces together that he actually works for her father, and that her father was actually the one that purchased all the arts from her event. She kicks him out, but I still think we're going to probably get more of Nico because it seems like her father's going to be a big character in this second part. But she kicks him out to invite our boy Joe over. So we have these two people escaping and running away from their past, as Kate vows to never question Joe's past, and he's going to do the same for her, and they are going to try to make this thing work. And we know as an audience, Joe has a weakness, and it is falling in love, and it looks like he's officially head over heels for Kate, which we know will not be a good thing. But ending up this episode, Reese yet again breaks into Joe's house to celebrate, but he also can't overlook him labeling Dawn as erotomania, which in definition is a form of delusion disorder in which an individual believes that another person, usually of higher status, is in love with them. Could Joe be suffering from this same thing? Going back to you all's Reese theories, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So I think it's very plausible, if I'm being honest with you all. But as he's there, he's talking about what's next for him and his new best friend Joe, and it is the biggest and greatest main event, and that is to take out and kill Kate's father, the devil, together as best friends. To episode 7, titled Good Man, Cruel World. Spoilers ahead. As Jonathan and Kate officially go on an actual date, we see Joe gets to know the real her. She's a kind person, she listens, and they have this moment in which they have this pretend future together in which they want to have a house, they want to have kids, and I don't think we've seen Kate smile as much as she's doing in this exact scene. But, you know, I can't seem to shake this feeling. I know her and Malcolm weren't on the best of terms in their relationship, but still, that was her boyfriend for several years and he was recently murdered. She is just moving on so quickly. It seems so odd to me. Now, I don't know if this is a character flaw. Is this just a result of how she was raised to not really have feelings? I don't know, y'all. Let me know what you all think about Kate just moving on so quickly in the comments below. As we see the conversation between Joe and Reese talking about killing Tom Lockwood, Reese tells him he promises this is the last favor, and if he does this, Joe will be able to balance the scales and essentially atone for his sins. Now, as this was going on, I was thinking to myself, in reality, he's just really using Joe as his personal hitman, and if Reese is to be a real individual, what does Tom Lockwood have over him? We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Now, Joe manages to invite himself to going with Kate and meeting her father in order to begin the process of trying to find a way to maybe not kill her father. Meanwhile, Nadia is researching about the Eat the Rich killer and feels Dawn being the killer is just way too easy, and her conspiracy theory about Joe being involved begins. Speaking of Joe, he's doing his own research on Tom Lockwood, as it appears he's managed to wipe all the evidence of his past wrongdoings off the entire internet. Back with Nadia, she catches Joe in a lie as he's dodging questions about him reading her stories after she tried to get some answers out of him about what happened the night of dawn. I'm really enjoying how much Nadia is kind of picking at Joe, but we all know if someone digs too deep in Joe, they end up 6 feet under. So I'm kind of scared for Nadia, and we'll talk about what happens to her a little bit later in this episode, as it is time to officially meet Tom, played by Greg Kinnear, and immediately this character has my full attention. After he shakes the hand of Jonathan, he tells him the following: "I look forward to getting to know you, Joe." How the hell does he already know who he is? And all this is going on. We're only 10 minutes into this fantastic episode. Now, 4 courses into their meal, Joe has no idea what Tom has over Reese, but more importantly, what does he know about Joe? As dessert arrives in the form of a museum structure, as Tom offers Kate this museum for her to run on her own, and it will be called the Lockwood Museum, located in New York City. Now, this is clearly overwhelming for Kate, who has to think about taking up this offer as she goes to the restroom, leaving Joe and Tom alone. Now, Tom takes this opportunity and cuts straight to the chase. What can you tell me about Love Quinn, and did you kill her, or did you kill anyone of that matter? We see Joe manages to dodge the heat temporarily as Tom reminds him to not hurt Kate or else he'll meet the real Tom. Now, if I'm in Joe's position, I'm not messing around with Tom. He seems to be someone that you don't want to ruffle their feathers. But more interesting is Tom brings Reese up in the conversation as he's in Kate's circle, and he wants Joe to tell him about Reese. Now, as it appears, Reese is a threat to Tom because of the book he has coming out soon, and maybe whatever he's going to put in this book could be damaging to the political career that Tom wants to pursue. We see Tom uses this as leverage. If Joe can get dirt on him, he'll be grateful, aka Tom won't expose Joe and he'll protect him, as Joe will use Tom to put Reese in prison. This is shaping up to be very, very interesting. So I assume, based on Tom and his status, that he probably had a team of researchers looking up Jonathan, aka Joe's past, to find all this information. Or is it possible that Tom Lockwood has some personal connections to the Quinn family? Let me know your thoughts on all that. Meanwhile, we see Phoebe is staying with Kate after the recent Dawn situation, and she may be suffering from PTSD after not only that, but all the stuff that's recently happened. Kate suggests that she seeks help, and she agrees to do so. In comes Adam, who's in the process of losing everything. He convinces Kate to allow him to take Phoebe to the hospital. Now, this plot has to be more significant, right? Because I don't think it's just face value in regards to just seeing this toxic relationship with these two broken people. I'm very curious to see where this goes, but I still have my thoughts that Phoebe isn't as innocent as she plays out to be. Let me know where you all think this particular plot is headed. As Joe baits Reese into coming over, and my suggestion that I said in my last breakdown that Joe should record their conversation, he actually does that. Now, literally within seconds, we see Reese realize that he's being recorded, almost like he saw it coming. But again, before the major reveal, in this moment, I'm saying to myself, okay, how the hell did he know he was being recorded? Does he have cameras in Joe's place? There's no way he would have known that. But again, he knows that because it's actually Joe that we'll talk about. But back to the actual scene. Another plot point that I mentioned in my last breakdown was what's going to happen with Mairin. Well, we see Reese pulls out her passport and he's actually taking her hostage. And if Joe doesn't kill Lockwood in 24 hours, she's going to end up dead. This episode is getting better and better as it goes on. As we cut to the next morning, Joe sees the smear campaign from Tom on Reese has begun as Kate arrives and she tells him some truths. When Kate was 19, she was the one that was actually responsible for those kids getting cancer. Wasn't eating her alive, as she claims that she's actually worse than her father. We see Joe doesn't even bat an eye and he accepts her even after hearing this news. I guess they're just both terrible people that's done terrible things and they seem to be a perfect match, right? But I'm very curious on what else has Kate done in her past that she might be hiding. So the clock is ticking and Joe meets with Tom and he manages to get him alone to talk about Reese in this private room with no cameras. Now Joe proceeds to follow along with potentially killing him, but we see Tom finds a way to get in his head by bringing up Reese. But it doesn't stop there, as Tom flat out says that he knows that Joe killed Love Quinn and he doesn't really care. The point is he did it and he managed to get away with it. He talks about his plans to take Reese down. He has begun with this plan by forcing him into hiding with his ex-wife. Tom switches the whole game plan and he wants Joe to kill Reese and he tells him that he will be his best self. Okay, Tom is evil and despicable as hell, y'all, but what a great character so far, and he's had so little screen time so far, but he's caused so much damage. I am really enjoying this character, how he's written so far. But back with Kate, she learns that not only did Phoebe not go seek help, but she's now engaged to Adam. Again, I'm just so curious to see where they're going to actually take this storyline. Meanwhile, Nadia gets her locksmith relative to break into Joe's house in hopes to finding something on him, which she does, and she finds a key hidden in a book. We see Edward also helps her by sending her photos taken by Dawn, in which Nadia notices Joe's secret lair, which happened to be introduced earlier in this episode. It was across the street from where we saw Kate and Joe eating Indian food. Back to Joe, he goes to Reese's hideout, which we get a brief scene between Reese and his ex-wife, whose name was Emma. They're getting into a fight. She drives off, which leads Joe to knocking Reese out. But right before he knocks out Reese, Reese appeared to not have any idea who Joe was. We cut to the scene and seeing Reese tied up and completely helpless. Joe takes extreme measures to find a location of Mairin, and those measures are extremely painful. But again, Reese has no idea what Joe is talking about. In full-on rage mode, we see Joe chokes Reese and actually kills him. And in comes Reese. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, it appears that Joe has made him up all in his head to become less of a psychopath. So pat yourself on the back right now if you were one of those people that thought that Reese was made up in Joe's head, because hey, you were right. Back to Nadia and Joe's secret lair. She uses the key, she finds Mairin, and we got the return of Joe's secret hiding cage, part 2, episode 8, titled Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Full spoilers ahead. Now, for those that aren't too familiar with this title, it comes from Joyce Carol Oates in a form of short stories, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? As it tells the story of this young lady's journey to find her own identity. Along the way, she uses her beauty to create in her mind a feeling of maturity, which ultimately becomes her downfall. Now, interestingly enough, I think that there's connections with that title and paralleling to what's going on with Joe, as he has created these stories in his head, and it might end up being his downfall. So I think it's a very effective way to use this title, as we open the episode with a flashback of hearing Mairin's voiceover as she's in Paris with her daughter right before she has to go to the art fair, and we see what really happened to her from her perspective of when Joe took her. As we cut to an apartment where Joe is holding her as he studies a video of Reese, as we haven't seen this side of Joe in a very long time. I mean, he is cold, he is calculus, and he's really not present, as this reminds us all as an audience of how evil and how dangerous Joe really is. And just taking a brief moment here, honestly, this show has done such a masterful job of tricking us with Joe's charm because we have sometimes forgot that he is the real villain of the series. Now, we get a bit of insight on the question I posed in my last video. Why did Joe choose Reese? As Joe tells Mairin that Reese used to have a dark past, but as time went by, he made a change. And within that change, he became everyone's favorite hero and people want him to run for mayor, and that inspired Joe. So it's starting to make sense on why Joe would choose someone like this, someone that had a dark past, but all of a sudden made a needed change, and now that change has helped him become the hero, and I think it's safe to say that Joe wants to do the same thing. As Joe continues to stalk up and study up on Reese and keep Mairin hostage, we see her attempt to escape before being kept in his cage, but she ultimately fails and breaks her arm in the process. In this moment, as she pleads with Joe to set her free, we see Joe completely blanking out and talking to himself and bangs his head against the cage as he reveals that he's not Joe and he has this creepy, dark, sinister smile on his face. Listen, I think Joe is too far gone to ever make a return to some type of normalcy. There's even the moment where we see Joe dropping off food and also painkillers to maybe help out her healing her arm, and a lot of us might think, well, maybe there's a little bit of kindness left in Joe. I don't think so. I think we're seeing the dark side of Joe really taking over, and I think that that gesture was really kind of a dark gesture because Joe knows that she used to be a drug addict and she would probably relapse if she took those pills. So I think this is just showing us an example of how dark and how far gone he is from being that nice Joe that we thought he was at one point. Now, as this is happening, this story is kind of being told from the perspective of Mairin as she's reading this Nightingale story to her daughter, and personally, as we get this non-linear storytelling to convey her emotions, it really worked for me. But let me know in the comments what you all thought of the storytelling method. See her trying to kill Joe with kindness only for whatever this persona that he's created inside of his head tells her that Joe is not here and that she's being kept here until he finally comes back to kill her. I'm gonna tell y'all something right now. I was so impressed by these performances by both actors. This episode was just so great for me so far. Let me know where you all were at in this point in the episode as we get this montage of a day after day where we see her doing the same routine with her broken arm, but she's not broken as she fights to stay strong to see her daughter again, but she starts to realize that the food is running low and she ultimately snaps and she starts to lose it, which is understandable as it's in this moment that Nadia finds her from the last episode. Cut to Joe, who's told by his made-up version of Reese that this has been brewing for a long time in his head. Now, we see a shift in the Reese made-up version has kind of changed as he's trying to do something for Joe in this episode, which is help him remember that he hasn't been checking in on Mairin. Now, Joe, who is just in full denial, he doesn't think he's crazy. He actually tries to prove it to himself as he replays his hidden camera footage, only showing that he was talking to himself when he met with Reese last. And then we get the flashback of all the times in part 1 of him talking to himself and not Reese. The only time Reese was actually present is when he was at the funeral, when he acknowledged Joe was there, only to just nod at him, and also every time he was on camera, seeing on the television perspective, that was the real version of Reese, and every other time was just simply made up in Joe's head. As we see Joe trying to justify the killings of what he did in the first half of this season. So I guess it's safe to say that my second killer theories can be thrown out of the window, as it's time for Joe to know who he really is in order to find Mairin. Back to Nadia and Mairin. Nadia is being told by Mairin to not get the police involved because Joe will find a way out. And I can't lie, I don't think that's the best decision, but she does make a point that every time Joe gets involved with the police, he finds a way to trick them out of the situation every single time. Now, the plan is for Nadia to return soon with an actual plan, but meanwhile, she must not get caught by Joe. Mairin seems to hope that this plan will work. We get this brief scene in which we see Kate and Joe having a conversation discussing Adam and Phoebe's engagement party as we cut to Nadia in class with Joe, and she's kind of making it abundantly clear that there's something that's throwing her off, and we see that the Reese actually notices this. But Joe believes that this is just an issue that she's having with her boyfriend, and I think, again, Nadia has become one of my favorite characters as this second part is going on because she's so smart in these situations. As we cut to seeing Kate trying to convince Phoebe to forget about this engagement party and seek out the help that she needs, it was in this scene that it finally hit me as far as the question I've been asking: what is the importance of Phoebe and Adam? Don't get me wrong, I enjoy these characters. They bring a lot of levity into this dark show sometimes, but a lot of times when we cut to them, it kind of feels unnecessary. But I'm looking at Phoebe here, taking a step back and looking at this character. She's a prime example of what happens when we suppress our emotions and our feelings and we create these fairy tales that everything is fine by focusing on others and not helping ourselves. And she's doing the same thing with Adam. She's trying to fix him and trying to help him through his problems. And we can parallel that to what's going on with Joe. Joe is a broken individual, but he'll rather ignore his mental health issues and he inserts himself in everyone else's lives. So I think that, and plus I think that there will be some more meat to what's going on with Phoebe and Adam, and I wouldn't be surprised if Adam ends up being killed by Joe. But the kind of deeper meaning of this character is the idea of what happens when you ignore your true issues and trying to help other people. You forget to help yourself. So let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below, or if you think there's a different point of that particular plot, let's talk about that in the comment section. Back with Joe, who's torn his apartment to pieces in order to find a clue of where he can find Mairin, but has no luck, as Reese gives him a tip, which is looking into his Jekyll and Hyde book, which I think is hilarious, where we see Nadia has placed a key back there, but also he finds the notes that he took, obsessing over Reese, and we get the return of the box that we see for the first time this season with all his handy-dandy souvenirs, but more importantly, he finds a map with the location of Mairin. We end this episode with Joe getting closer and warmer to the location, as Nadia has also arrived as promised. Now, the plan that Nadia comes up with isn't revealed to us as an audience, as we see Joe slowly starting to remember what he's done as he enters the lair, and we fade to black. Episode 9, titled She's Not There, an episode directed by the one and only Joe himself, Penn Badgley. Full spoilers ahead. As Joe appears to be frightened of what he's done, we see Nadia and Mairin have come up with a plan that we don't hear about, as we see Joe enters the room downstairs as Nadia hides. The more level-headed Joe is present, and we can see that Mairin notices this, as Joe promises to fix himself and tells her he's going to fix everything, as she's begging for him to let her go, but he has to leave. But first thing in the morning, he promises he'll return with a plan. We see Nadia believes that the best plan at hand is to actually kill Joe, as Nadia will get the drugs to knock him out and get a drill to set her free, but more importantly, get a knife to finish him. Meanwhile, at the engagement party, we see Kate overhears Adam's bet with Steve, as Kate shares what she's heard with Phoebe and tries to get through to her and brings up how people like Adam take advantage of her, but Phoebe doesn't want to hear any of this. Back at Joe's place, we see evil Reese is distracting him as he attempts to come up with a plan, but Reese has a surprise for Joe in the freezer, and it's a gun to kill Mairin. But we see Joe refuses to use his gun to do so and kill Mairin, as Joe seems to think he's got a plan, and it involves saving her and saying goodbye to Kate. We see Joe wants to play hero one last time and helping Kate save her best friend, and they work together in doing so. Joe talks to Phoebe and uses reverse psychology on her, and it starts to work, but Adam arrives just in time. I gotta say, I much more preferred the part 1 versions of both characters, Adam and Phoebe, because in this second part, both of their characters seem so one-dimensional, and Adam went from being the second in line in this relationship to fully controlling every move that Phoebe makes. To me, it just feels so rushed and underdeveloped. Let me know if you all feel the same thing in regards to the change of these characters in the comments below. Now we see the mission has failed. As they've arrived to her place, Joe speaks from the heart in telling Kate that he thanks her for making him a changed man. He manages to keep his composure and not go upstairs with her, and promises to call her first thing in the morning, but first he has to take care of a few things. While this is happening, Phoebe unfortunately makes the terrible decision in marrying Adam, and you can see the look on her face of disappointment and regret as she takes a moment to herself to have a mental breakdown. As Joe heads over to tell Mairin that he's got a plan and he agrees to check in on her daughter, only to find out that her sudden departure has caused her to lose custody of her child. After hearing the news, Mairin would rather die than not be with her daughter, as we see Joe just continues to ruin her life. As Nadia rushes to get back to Mairin with all the supplies she needs, she unfortunately drops all her belongings in front of an officer who sees the knife and wants to question her. Meanwhile, Joe, having heard enough of his evil side about killing Mairin, he decides to take tranquilizer pills that Kate found at Phoebe's engagement party in order to fall asleep and wake up in the next morning. As it appears that Joe is ready to free Mairin, but there's one problem. Joe arrives and he can't remember the code, and also it appears that he might have put something in her drink that is killing her, which causes him to go into a panic as he pays a visit in his inner thoughts, and we arrive back to his home to find Gemma there. As we watch this inner battle between Joe and his dark past, Gemma mocks him for not willing to do what needs to be done, which leads him to another location, and that is the return of Season 1 U, and that is Beck. Before we talk about this conversation between Joe and Beck, I gotta admit, having Jim in there felt a little bit out of place. Number one, they didn't spend that much time together, and also it seems like this part of his brain is involving all the women he fell in love with and hurt, so I thought it would have been more perfect for Delilah to be there versus Gemma. Either way, as I digress, we have the scene with Beck and Joe as she reminds him of what he took away from her and tells him how he's never saved anyone as she swallows the key that he needs to free Mairin, which leads him to finding his next victim, the one and only woman who matches energy and my personal favorite ex of his, Love. We, us, our love language, as we see Love telling Joe his pattern and never taking any responsibility. She questions if he ever truly loved these women, and we see Love places the gun in his hand and proceeds to shoot him, simply implying what he needs to do, and that is ending his terror of pain and suffering. Joe must end, as this was all a dream happening. So I gotta say, even though I'm not the biggest Beck fan from Season 1, I did like her presence in this scene, and I know she appeared in Season 2 as well, but I do think she fit well in this moment here. I love the character Love, and I knew when we saw her in the trailer that it wasn't going to be her showing that she's alive and she's back for revenge, that it was going to be a part of Joe having a hallucination, but regardless, she's so fantastic. She ate up that scene. My only issue with this scene was, again, I wish they would have substituted having Jim in there and maybe replacing her with Delilah. Even hell, having Candace pop up in that moment seemed to be a better fit than Gemma. But let me know your thoughts on those cameos in the comments below. As Joe awakes and we see Reese tries to stop him, but it doesn't work as Joe heads back to Mairin. As we cut to seeing Adam thinking he's living his best life with his sexual partners, only to see that they have been hired by someone else, and that is Tom. As we end this episode, we learn that Tom actually had Adam killed, which I figured was going to be the case for Adam, but I thought it was going to be at the hands of Joe. Kate can't believe what he's done and says that this is the last time he'll be seeing her, but Tom, he isn't having it. He reveals that all the things Kate believes she made up on her own were all actually because of him, all behind the scenes. Even this sexual harassment case that Malcolm was involved with that she didn't know about, he took care of that. So we see Tom telling her that she is his favorite child out of the 7 kids that he has, and he tells her that he owns everything in this world, including Kate, leaving her in pure shock. So the question is, will Kate end up taking this offer, or will she go a step further and actually kill her father in order to escape him? Let me know your thoughts on that in the comment section. As Nadia makes it out of jail and runs to go to Mairin. Meanwhile, Joe arrives to find that she's taken the pills and she's on the verge of dying. 4th season of You, Part 2, explaining the ending of the finale, Episode 10, which was titled The Death of Jonathan Moore. A very fitting title for this finale as we see the rebirth of Joe Goldberg. Before we get into it, I want to thank every single one of you all that's been watching this series of reviews in which I broke down each episode of this 4th season. I really appreciate the support. With that being said, we got an episode to break down. Full spoilers ahead. We open with Joe burning a letter left behind by Mairin, requesting him to leaving her where she can be found so that her daughter won't have to suffer thinking her mother's still out there alive, which is very important for a little bit later on. We see Joe places her body on this bench. Fast forwarding to the next day, in class, we see the students discover that Reese's body was found in the woods, and Joe is very surprised. Cut to seeing Nadia apologizing to Edward about her recent behavior as she shows him an article about Love Quinn's death involving Joe. Now, Nadia takes Edward to Joe's secret location to prove her point as the cage is now gone. Edward claims to believe her as they plan to take down Joe together. Back home with Joe, he begins to write his letter explaining his crimes as he plans to end it all. We see Reese tells him that he's wasted his time because Tom Lockwood is coming for him, but this conversation is cut short because Kate messages Joe that she needs him because this is an emergency. Kate tells him she planned on skipping town, but proceeds to go ahead and telling him about a time when she was younger and when she discovered that her father was just so obsessed and so controlling about everything in her life that he actually hired someone to follow her everywhere she went in a form of some type of protection. We see that she tells Joe about what happened when she spoke to her father last and questions if Joe was even hired by him. Now, we see at this point, as I stated in my previous breakdown, it was just a matter of time after hearing Kate tell him how her father owns her. We see Joe getting ready to do what he does best, and that's setting his sight on killing Tom Lockwood. But first, Joe must confront his inner self as he's having a conversation with Reese, and we see them having this conversation about potentially coming to an agreement about how this relationship will be working moving forward, as he suggests that they should integrate, as we see the plan is set in motion to kill Tom Lockwood. Get a quick scene first as we see Edward gives Nadia a USB with everything about the Eat the Rich killer and Reese, as this will help build the case against Joe, which will end up going against Edward a little bit later on. We see Joe manages to sneak into Tom's hangar but misses the opportunity to knock him out, so he has to make up a quick story on why he's here, as we see Joe goes on about his concerns about the discovery of Reese's body. As Tom goes to reach for his phone to relieve Joe of his worries, we see that he turns his back to Joe, which allows Joe to take him down. Now, we see Tom doesn't beg for his life, but instead he tries to get into Joe's head by telling Joe that Kate doesn't really care about him and he always has been there to protect her. Now, the conversation is abruptly ended as Tom's bodyguard arrives, forcing Joe to actually killing him. Now, we see Tom showing some concern for his life after seeing what Joe is capable of, as he offers Joe a clean slate and a fresh start by making him extremely rich and saving Joe, but we see Joe doesn't take the bait as Tom makes his final plea by saying he and Joe are two of the same, as they're trying to protect Kate at all costs, but Joe has heard enough and he kills Tom Lockwood. Now, Joe takes his next steps in making it seem as though Tom's bodyguard Hugo is responsible for killing him, because Joe finds out that Hugo has some financial issues, and those issues are made to believe that Hugo ended up robbing and eventually killing Tom. This leaves Joe with one task left, which is ending himself. We see Joe's inner Reese is making a final case of keeping Joe alive as Kate gives him a call, but Joe throws his phone away because he believes it's inevitable that she'll end up dead like the others. Now, Joe confronts himself about how much he hates and despises this darkness inside of him. Joe thanks himself by throwing Reese over the bridge and necks himself, as we see him replaying his moments with Kate and other moments of him experiencing falling in love. We see him diving deeper and deeper into the depths of the water, and it appears that Joe Goldberg is gone forever. Back with Nadia and Edward, she tells him something that he must never tell and the reason why she must stop Joe. We cut back to the conversation between Nadia and Mairin in episode 9, in which they come up with their plan of killing Joe, and as I predicted in my last video, those pills were all a part of the plan, but the part that caught me off guard was finding out that the whole setup of her losing her daughter was also a part of the plan. So I gotta say, it was a pretty good plan by those two. We cut to Nadia waking up Mairin after Joe left her on the bench, as she's safe and Joe believes she's dead. But Nadia is still worried about Joe, as her and Edward head to his flat to discover the last pieces of the evidence to put him away for good. We cut to a hospital bed to find Joe is still alive. He was found by the police and believed to have accidentally fallen off the bridge as Kate arrives. Now, Joe doesn't want to start off by lying, and he tells her he didn't fall, and he doesn't stop there. He tells her that he's killed people. As we see, Kate is aware about who killed Reese, and being that her father got Joe involved to have this done, as we find out that she is now taking the responsibility of being the CEO of the company. Kate believes Joe is good and offers him a deal of keeping each other good for the remainder of their lives. He is truly a Lockwood. Joe might have found someone that actually loves him, as Joe tells her everything from the start, and he starts by telling her his actual name. So Kate now officially knows all his secrets, but my question is, has she told him everything as well? Back with Nadia and Edward, she searches in Joe's belongings and discovers his box of souvenirs and takes a picture of it all. She heads back to Edward and she can't seem to find him, and Joe has arrived. So I guess the hospital let Joe out early because Kate's new status of power. As we see, Joe is cool, calm, and collected. He takes Nadia's phone and deletes the picture she took, as Joe tells her she's not in danger because his situation has changed, because he now has unlimited resources, and offers her a way to make this work for everybody. Now, we end the episode with meeting the new owners of Adam's old club, which is Blessing and Sophia. We see that Rold has returned from his vacation, as well as Connie is back from rehab, and these people are still terrible individuals. Meanwhile, we see that Phoebe is teaching children English in Thailand, and she appears to be happy. We cut to seeing Mairin and her daughter are safe and happy back in Paris, as she reads an article on her phone about Joe and Kate being happy and celebrating their second chances in life. And if you notice in this scene, she seems to be a little bit upset, and rightfully so, and we'll talk about her in a little bit here, as we see the freshly shaved Joe and Kate are being interviewed back home in New York City at the Lockwood Museum about the tragic past of Love Quinn, and seeing that Joe had faked his own death. But with Tom's previous publicist, Cynthia, they managed to dodge the important questions that many have, as we see exactly how Joe managed to keep Nadia quiet. We cut back to that scene where we see Joe actually killed Edward, and we see that Nadia was in shock, and she takes the knife that Joe used to kill Edward, and you'll notice that it appears that Joe has officially accepted his dark side, as he puts everything in motion to make it seem as though Edward was the one responsible for Reese's death because of that USB drive that he showed earlier in the episode, and says that Nadia killed him, as Joe tells her how smart she is, and he's looking forward to seeing how she's going to find her way out of this situation. We see Joe walks away, and he explains that Nadia remains silent in prison. As we wrap up our final scene, we see our last shot of Joe back in New York looking back at himself, and we see Reese in the mirror smiling back at him. The plan for this new power couple is to change the world, and if killing is needed, it's much easier this time around because Joe is now honest with himself about everything that he does. So we see that Joe would rather die than take responsibility of his actions, and he's been officially reborn and has all the tools at his disposal and escapes again, as he's now accepted who he really is, which to me means that all these innocent people in the future will die. So the question is, what next? I would imagine if there is to be a season 5, which as I'm recording this, there has been no official announcement, but I would bet my money that we would see all those he left behind and alive and has damaged their lives will be seeking revenge on Joe. And you might be asking, well, who are those people? Well, starting off with the Quinn family, who were led to believe that the hitman they hired in this season killed Joe. So I bet they will be seeking some type of vengeance and also seeking their justice for their daughter, as well as 40. And you can't forget about Ellie, whose sister Delilah was killed by Love back in season 2. And if you all do not know, Jenna Ortega was supposed to be in this new season of You, but due to scheduling issues with Shooting Wednesday, she wasn't able to. So I would bet that she will be a part of a season 5. And I also believe, even though she's safe with her daughter in Paris, Marianne would want revenge once she finds out that the person that saved her is in prison, which is Nadia. And I wouldn't be surprised if Nadia is a part of this plan, but also she might recruit Dawn, who by all means was a stalker in her own right, but we know that Joel framed her for murder, so she's going to probably have some vengeance as well. Also, you can't forget that Edward's mom runs the newspaper, so she may be seeking vengeance because she knows her son isn't capable of murder and he has no reason had killed Reese. And also, I gotta say, I wouldn't be surprised if Rold won't be jealous of this new love between Kate and Joe and may want to help as well. But I do think, to me, it would be more fitting if all the women that Joe has affected would be the one taking charge. So overall, I thought this season did a really good job of showing us characters that would rather die or rather sell someone out than take any responsibility for their actions. Also, we saw on full display all the privileges that money can buy people of power. This show manages to continue to show us Joe taking down what he considers to be terrible people, which they are, whether you think about Malcolm or Simon or Gemma and even Tom Lockwood of that matter. He takes these people down, and there's some sense of poetic justice in doing so. But the show doesn't forget to show us that Joe is still the worst of them all, and he's now found Kate, who in some ways is probably more evil and bad than he is because she allows this stuff to happen. Now, Kate has known of all the cover-ups and the murders that her father committed, and she did nothing, and she was responsible for those kids getting cancer, and she took no responsibility. So this is a very good theme that I think the show is really displaying, is again these privileges and how people don't take any responsibility for any of their actions. Now, while I did enjoy part 1, I thought part 2 was the better half. Now, I thought the story was richer, the suspense was better, and the performances, man, Penn Badgley's performance was great. He was great in part 1, but he was phenomenal in the second half, and shout out to him for directing his first episode of this series. And speaking of phenomenal, Tati Gabrielle was absolutely great. I love that they brought her story back into the mix, and I do think she will be a part in season 5, as I had mentioned earlier. But man, think about episode 8 and how incredible she was in that moment and in those scenes. And I can't leave out shouting out Ed Spellers, who played Reese in this season. He was stellar as well. So for those that are watching, those are my thoughts on the entirety of season 4 on this finale, and I want to thank you all for watching this video. And for those who watched all 5 breakdowns for part 2, put in the comments right now 5 for 5. Thank you so much for the support. And for those that watched all 10 of my breakdowns for every single episode of this 4th season, put in the comments right now 10 for 10. And you, my friends, are the best and are the real MVPs. I really appreciate y'all. So leave your thoughts in the comments on part 2, on this finale of season 4. Which part did you enjoy more? And of course, share your predictions and your theories about what you all hope to see in a part 5, or I should say season 5. I'll be making some short form content for my rankings of the seasons of You, and I'll have some other videos that you all can keep an eye out for this show. Stay tuned for that. Before you all leave, just a friendly reminder, if you enjoyed today's content, make sure you all are hitting that thumbs up, sharing this video, leaving your thoughts in the comments, subscribe by clicking right here, check out my latest video, and check out my playlist for all my You breakdowns. You all are great, stay safe, and I'll see you all on the next breakdown.